It is 1958. The tent is borrowed. The congregation is 5 people, and 4 of them are children. No one standing in that muddy field on the edge of a ruined city could have imagined that they were witnessing the first breath of something that would one day hold 1 million souls. The canvas walls are thin, and the wind off the Han River moves through them like a living thing. And outside the city is still learning to be a city again after everything the war took from it. But inside, a young man is speaking. And what he is saying is so large, so structurally impossible, so resistant to the measurable dimensions of the world in which he is standing, that the only reasonable response is either to walk away or to stay and let it change you. There is a particular kind of ruin that only war can produce, not merely the destruction of buildings. Buildings can be rebuilt and have been, in every corner of the world where war has passed through and moved on. What war destroys with a precision that no architect could equal is the interior landscape of a people. The sense that the future is a place one is allowed to inhabit. The belief that what you build today will still be standing tomorrow. The quiet confidence, so ordinary that it is invisible until it is gone, that the world has a basic structural integrity, that the ground beneath your feet is ground and not a surface waiting to become a crater. Seoul in the mid-1950s was a city relearning these things. It had been fought over, abandoned, recaptured, bombed, shelled, flooded with refugees, emptied of everything that could be carried, and left to rebuild itself out of whatever remained. What remained was not much. The physical infrastructure of the city, the roads, the bridges, the water systems, the electrical grids, the buildings that had given the city its form and function, had been devastated with a thoroughness that left the people who walked through the aftermath struggling to find landmarks they had known all their lives. The city they had grown up in was gone. In its place was rubble, and in the rubble, people were already building, because the alternative was not to build, and that was not an alternative that the Korean people, with the particular tenacity that centuries of occupation and hardship had produced, were willing to accept. Into this city, in these years, came Paul Yonggi Cho. He had not come from wealth. He had not come from a family of religious leaders or institutional connections that might have smoothed his path into the work he felt called to do. He had come from Ulsan, from a modest family, with the particular combination of intelligence and determination and nothing to lose that produces, in the right conditions, either despair or extraordinary action. He had arrived at the edge of despair already in 1954, when the tuberculosis that had been consuming him for months had brought him to a hospital cot and left him there to wait for an ending that the doctors considered inevitable. He did not end. This is the foundational fact around which everything else in the story arranges itself. He did not end. The disease that had been systematically dismantling his body, the coughing that shook him to his foundations, the weight that fell from him like water, the color that drained from his face until he had the particular translucency of those who are becoming more memory than person, retreated. It retreated in a way that the doctors who had told him to prepare for death could not account for with the vocabulary their training had given them. It retreated in response to something that had entered the young man's life in the form of a Bible placed in his hands by a missionary woman, and a prayer offered in a hospital room, and an encounter with the text of that Bible that he could only describe as a conversation. A conversation in which something spoke to him with an intimacy and a specificity that he had not expected from a document that was also read by millions of other people in millions of other rooms across the world. He came out of that hospital changed. The word conversion is too small for what had happened to him. Conversion implies a switching of categories, a movement from one column to another in some theological ledger. What had happened to Paul Yonggi Cho was more structural than that, more thorough, more irreversible. He had been taken apart by illness and put back together by something he could only call grace, and the version of him that was put back together was organized around a center that had not been there before, or had perhaps been there always, waiting for the illness to clear away everything that was obscuring it. He began to preach. There is no more complicated way to say it. He began to stand in places where people gathered and to speak about what he knew, which was this: that a God existed who was interested in the specific and material conditions of human lives, not merely their eternal destinations; that this God had demonstrated that interest in the particular case of a dying young man from Ulsan by declining to let him die; that what had happened to that young man could happen to others, was in fact being offered to others, was available to anyone willing to stand still long enough to receive it. He preached in the streets. He preached in the markets, where women selling vegetables and fish would pause their transactions to listen to the thin young man with the voice that carried further than his frame suggested it should. He preached in the spaces between buildings, in the courtyards of apartment blocks that had survived the bombing, in the open ground where buildings had not survived, and the rubble had been cleared, and the space was waiting for someone to decide what it would become next. He preached because he had something to say, and because the people he was saying it to were people in need of exactly what he was offering. Not money, not food, not medicine, though they needed all of those things too, but the particular nourishment of being told that their lives were not accidents, that they were not simply the random victims of geopolitical forces too large for any individual to comprehend or resist, that they were known, that they were seen, that they were held in the attention of something that had not been destroyed by the war and could not be. The tent arrived in 1958. Calling it a tent is accurate but incomplete, in the way that calling a cathedral a building is accurate but incomplete. It was a tent in the material sense: canvas, poles, the kind of structure the military had used and discarded, and that had found its way into the economy of second-hand goods that sustained the poorer districts of the city. It was not designed to be a sacred space. It was designed to be a temporary shelter, a functional answer to the question of where to put things and people when there is no better answer available. It had no windows that could hold stained glass. It had no stone floors that could echo with footsteps. It had no ceiling high enough to suggest the distance between the human and the divine. What it had was walls, a roof, and the capacity to keep the rain out most of the time. He pitched it in the Daejeon district on the outskirts of Seoul, in an area that was not the center of anything, not the center of commerce, not the center of culture, not the center of the city's reconstructing civic life. It was the margin, the edge, the place where those who had not yet found their footing in the rebuilding city had settled, because the margins are always where people go when the center has no room for them. This was, in retrospect, exactly the right location for what Paul Yonggi was attempting. The center was not his audience. The people who had lost everything, who were starting again from zero, who needed to be told that zero was not the end of the story, those were his audience. On the first Sunday, 5 people came. This number has been reported so many times in so many contexts that it has acquired a kind of legendary quality, the way founding numbers often do. The 12 apostles, the handful of revolutionaries in a back room, the small group of believers in a borrowed space who are the origin point of something enormous. But it is worth pausing with the reality of it, the unlegendary, unglamorous, simply human reality of standing in a borrowed canvas tent in a marginal district of a city, still organizing itself out of rubble, and looking at your congregation of 5 people, 4 of whom are children, and choosing to begin. He began. He preached to the 5 as though they were 500. He brought to that canvas tent the same fullness of attention, the same intensity of conviction, the same structural seriousness about what he was doing, that he would bring, years later, decades later, to the auditorium that held 10,000, the services that were broadcast to congregations too large to be contained in any single building. He understood, with an instinct that ran deeper than strategy, that the miracle was not the crowd. The miracle was the message. And the message did not require a crowd to be true. The tent grew. Not immediately, not with the cinematic speed of a story that has been edited for dramatic effect. It grew the way things grow in the real world, slowly, with reversals, with seasons of stagnation followed by sudden expansions that could not have been predicted from the outside. A family came who brought another family. A woman who had been healed of something, an illness, a grief, a despair that had settled into her body like a second skeleton, told someone else what had happened, and that someone else came to see for themselves. A man who had been skeptical brought his skepticism in person and found that it was not equal to what he encountered in the tent. The tent leaked. This is a fact that the gleaming record of institutional growth sometimes forgets to mention. The tent was made of second-hand canvas, which is to say canvas that had already weathered whatever the military had subjected it to before it found its way into Paul Yonggi Cho's possession. And it leaked in the rain with a democratic thoroughness that respected neither the congregation, nor the sermon, nor the particular desire of the preacher to maintain the conditions necessary for people to hear what he was saying. He preached in the rain. He preached through the leaking. He preached through the winters that drove the temperature so low that the breath of the congregation was visible in the air between them, small clouds of effort and belief rising together toward the canvas ceiling and dispersing. In those early years, the poverty was not a metaphor. It was the literal condition of the ministry. There were weeks when there was no money for food, when the choice between feeding the congregation and feeding oneself was not a rhetorical dilemma, but an actual one, resolved in the way that the people who have internalized a calling resolve such things, not by ignoring the hunger, but by continuing anyway, because the alternative of stopping is not really an alternative at all. His mother-in-law, Jashil Choi, who had become his earliest and most essential collaborator, worked alongside him in this poverty with a toughness that the comfortable history of later success can sometimes obscure. She was not a supporting character. She was a co-architect, working in the conditions that actual faith produces, not the faith of the testimony, retrospective and triumphant, but the faith of the Tuesday afternoon, when the money is gone and the tent is leaking and the next Sunday seems very far away. And yet Sunday always came, and the people who came on Sunday were more, gradually, than the people who had come the Sunday before. The numbers moved upward with the slow inevitability of a tide, not dramatic, not cinematic, but constant, accumulating, building toward a scale that no one standing in the borrowed tent in 1958 could have mathematically extrapolated from the data available to them. You cannot look at 5 people, 4 of them children, in a leaking canvas structure on the edge of a ruined city and calculate 1 million. The math does not work. The only way the math works is if you include a variable that does not appear in any ordinary equation. By the early 1960s, the tent had been replaced, not with a cathedral, not yet, with a building, a proper permanent structure that could hold a congregation that had grown beyond what canvas could contain. It was a significant moment, the transition from impermanence to permanence, from the tent that could be folded and moved to the walls that said, "We are here and we intend to remain." But the transition also carried a risk that Paul Yonggi Cho understood and guarded against, with a vigilance that shaped the entire architecture of what he was building. The risk of walls is that they can become the boundary of the community's concern, the limit of its attention and care. The risk of a building is that it can become an institution, and institutions develop interests of their own that are not always identical to the interests of the people they were created to serve. His answer to this risk was the cell group. It is difficult, from the distance of the present, to fully appreciate the originality of this structure, because it has since been adopted, adapted, replicated, studied in seminaries and business schools and organizational behavior departments across the world, to the point where it seems like an obvious idea. Of course, you divide a large community into small units. Of course, you ensure that intimacy is preserved as scale increases. Of course, you build in the mechanisms of mutual care that prevent any individual from becoming invisible within the mass. But in the late 1950s and early 1960s, in a Korean church culture that did not have this model available to it, it was not obvious. It was an invention born from a specific theological conviction that the God who had known Paul Yonggi Cho by name in his dying was a God who knew everyone by name, and that any structure which allowed people to become nameless was a structure in contradiction with the nature of the God it was meant to serve. Each cell was small, 10, 12, 15 people at most, meeting in homes, in the rooms of apartment buildings, in the spaces that ordinary life makes available when it is organized around mutual care rather than individual convenience. Each cell had a leader, not necessarily an ordained minister, not necessarily someone with formal theological training, but someone who had been equipped and trusted to hold the group together, to know the names and the stories and the specific burdens of the people in it. The cell was not a study group, though study happened there. It was not a social club, though friendship developed there. It was a structure of care, a deliberate creation of the conditions in which people could be known, really known, in the way that Paul Yonggi Cho had been known in that hospital room, by the community gathered in the name of what had known him. The cells multiplied. As the congregation grew, the cells divided, the way living things divide, each new cell carrying the structure and the purpose of the original. The person who had been a member became a leader. The leader who had been trained others. The multiplication was not bureaucratic, it was organic. It followed the logic of growth rather than the logic of administration. And it produced a community that could expand to scales that would have been impossible to maintain the intimacy of care if it had been structured around a single center, radiating outward. The move to Yeouido came in 1973. Yeouido Island in the Han River had been developed as a showcase district for the modernizing South Korean state. Broad boulevards, significant institutions, the ambition of a country that had been devastated 20 years earlier and was now building itself into an economic force that would astonish the world. The church that Paul Yonggi Cho, who had by then taken the name David, built on Yeouido was not modest. It held 10,000 people. At the time of its construction, it was among the largest church buildings in the world, a fact that was itself a kind of statement about the distance that had been traveled from the borrowed tent in Daejo, from the 5 people, 4 of them children, from the leaking canvas and the poverty and the preacher who continued anyway. The 10,000 became 50,000. The 50,000 became 100,000. The numbers moved upward with an acceleration that outpaced the buildings designed to contain them, so that the church was perpetually in the position of having more people than space and perpetually solving that problem, with additional services, with satellite locations, with television broadcasts that carried the worship of the congregation into the homes of people who could not fit in the building. By the mid-1980s, the Yeouido Full Gospel Church was not merely the largest church in South Korea. It was the largest church in the world. The number that would have seemed like a fantasy, 1 million souls, was approaching. 1 million people. Let that settle for a moment. Let it be more than a statistic. 1 million people is a city. 1 million people is a population that most nations in the world do not have within their borders. 1 million people is, in the context of a religious community, something for which there is no real precedent in human history. Not at this scale, not in this form, not organized around the principles of personal care and individual knowing that David Yonggi Cho had built into the structure from the beginning. There had been great cathedrals and great movements and great awakenings, but nothing quite like this. A community of 1 million people in which the founding principle was that no one was anonymous. The cell groups held that principle in place at the base of the structure, through all the growth and the buildings and the broadcasts and the international recognition. At the base, always, was the small room, the known names, the specific burdens carried together. At the base was the memory of the tent and the 5 people and the leaking canvas and the conviction, never abandoned, never traded for something more comfortable, that the work of the church was not to be impressive but to be present, not to accumulate power but to distribute care. David Yonggi Cho traveled the world. He trained pastors who founded their own congregations in dozens of countries. He wrote books translated into scores of languages. The model he had developed in a leaking tent in Daejo became a global template for how to build a community that grows without losing its essential character, the character of intimacy, of care, of the insistence that every person carries a name and a story that deserves to be known. He was not without shadow. The history of what he built includes chapters that are difficult, questions that are serious, failures of judgment and governance that the comprehensive record does not allow to be set aside. He was a man, with a man's limitations, who built something so large that its governance eventually exceeded his ability to fully oversee it. The later years of his public life included legal difficulties that the community he had built and the international community watching it had to reckon with. The story of David Yonggi Cho is not a story of perfection. It is a story of what is possible when a person is organized around a conviction deep enough to survive illness and poverty and the full weight of institutional complexity, and the shadow that such a story necessarily includes is part of its truth. But the tent is also true. The 5 people are also true. The leaking canvas and the bitter Korean winter and the choice to begin anyway, these are true, and they are the foundation of everything that followed, including the shadow. You cannot understand what was built without starting there, in the mud, in the cold, with a young man who had been told he was dying and had found, in the experience of not dying, a conviction large enough to sustain 1 million people. The Han River still runs past Yoido Island. The broad boulevards that showcase district have changed and been added to, and carry now the traffic of a city that has become, in the decades since the war, one of the great urban centers of the modern world. The church building that David Yonggi Cho built there still stands. The cell groups that carry the DNA of that original borrowed tent still meet, in homes, in apartments, in the small rooms of ordinary life organized around mutual care. The names are still being known. From a borrowed army tent with a leaking roof and 5 people, 4 of them children, to a community of 1 million souls organized around the principle that no one is anonymous. The distance is so large that it requires a different kind of measurement than miles or years can provide. It requires the measurement of what is possible when a conviction is deep enough, and a man is willing enough, and the cold is bitter enough, that the only thing left to do is begin. He began in a tent. He built a city of faith. And the tent was never really left behind. It lives in every cell group meeting, in every small room where names are known and burdens are shared, in every moment when the structure built for millions remembers that it was made, in the beginning, for 5.